Join me in welcoming Joe Strupp.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I feel like I'm in some kind of theater of the round. If any of you remember the famed CBS News producer Fred Friendly, he used to run, you ever watch any of his seminars where he walks around, and he's much more learned and experienced than I am, but it's nice to have a large group. I thank everyone for coming out, and Norwalk Library for feeding you all, which is well deserved, right? And I just want to talk quickly about, she said some of my background. I grew up in New Jersey and attended Brooklyn College, the City University of New York, and my first job was in Elizabeth, New Jersey at the Daily Journal, which is no longer with us. And I then moved to California, where I met my lovely wife, Claire, who's here. I worked at 2 newspapers in the Bay Area of San Francisco, covering everything from government to education to the gay community to politics to the environment. I then moved down to Southern California to the Press Enterprise in Riverside, which was a much larger paper, and I began freelancing then for editor and publisher, which covered the newspaper business for many years. I was there for 11 years, and that's really where I got my start covering media and started to really understand the problems with media that I say go beyond what you might hear. I know one of the problems that people claim is a liberal bias, that we're all liberal, left-wing communists and destroying the world through one-sided news. I don't believe that's the case. I think there's some bad journalism out there, just like everywhere. Every business has some bad performers, some bad work. But my problem with the business being presented that way was that I think it had other problems. And as I was doing my reporting, I was finding that the real problems are things like cutbacks in news. There are a lot fewer reporters than there used to be. Things like less money for news. Things like the internet came in, took a lot of advertising away. As many of you may know, the old days in newspapers, classified ads were king. Classifieds brought most newspapers their money, along with paid advertising for public notices and display advertising. But in general, small papers like The Hour, that's still going in Norwalk, and I'm glad to see that, the Stamford Advocate, the Greenwich Time, relied on a lot of classified ads. First, Craigslist came in, took a lot of those away, then Monster.com, CareerBuilder.com. And that's one of the things, when I used to be editor and publisher, I would write every year the top newspaper stories of the year, and number one was often loss of jobs. And I want to read one statistic from the book, and here it is, and you can buy it and I'll sign it, and thank you for coming out. Let's see. Just one simple statistic is that the U.S. Labor Department shows there were 38,790 jobs for reporters in mid-2017. That's a reduction from 2005 when there were 52,920 reporters and correspondents. That's a loss of more than 14,000 jobs in just over a decade. And the cutbacks continued in last year with the July 2018 Pew report that found that 36% of the largest newspapers in the US had experienced layoffs in the previous year. Larger newspapers, those with circulation of 250,000, were more likely, and 9 of the 16 newspapers with circulations of 250,000 or more, that's 56%, had serious layoffs. So that's just a cross-section of the cutbacks. But the cutbacks also affect areas that are covered, right? You live in a small town like nearby, Westport, Norwalk, some of these smaller towns, even the hour staff is not what it used to be. So people are not getting the coverage that they deserve. And that really bothered me because people were claiming news outlets were having trouble with their bias, which I don't believe is true. I believe it's more in how many people they have, how much focus they have on breaking news, quote unquote, right? Last time when you look at MSNBC or CNN, right, what do you see? Breaking news. And I have examples in the book about stories that were broken by AP in the morning, and you turn on CNN at night, and they're calling it breaking news. It's not breaking news. Of course, Fox is different. They have the Fox News Alert, which is their breaking news, right? That's not something that we need misinformation about a real breaking story. And then something does happen, it's not considered breaking news because it's all funneled together. It's like the boy who cried wolf, right? Now I hear something's breaking news. I'll say, okay, let's see what it is. I have examples in the story. In 2016, with the 2016 primary, Joe Biden was considering running. Now he's considering running again. He was deciding whether he wanted to run in 2016 or not. And CNN and MSNBC broke in that he had revealed the date that he was going to decide if he was going to run or not. Not if he had decided to run. And ABC, NBC, and CBS, network primetime, or not primetime, daytime programming, all the soap operas and game shows, right? They broke into that to say, well, Joe Biden has decided he's going to announce his decision to run on such and such a day. Not really important. Similar to that was another more recent story where Kim Jong-un's liaison to the US and President Trump's contact person for their summit that was later held, they had both left the White House after meeting to decide when the summit would be held. They hadn't decided when it would be held. And Trump and Un weren't involved. But because they had left the White House, all three networks broke into programming to say they had just left the White House after this important meeting. So this is the kind of thing that counts for breaking news, right? It's also at a time when more important stories are not covered. Things like the environment, things like our power grid. I talk about a book Ted Koppel wrote a few years ago about how our power grid is in sorry shape and very vulnerable. Environmental coverage, things like the Flint water crisis. I wrote an article back when I was at Media Matters for America. That was my last job. They were a media watchdog group that covered conservative media. We did a story on how the national press didn't really cover that crisis for about a year, despite the growing issues. And one of the Environmental Journalists Association of America presidents told me, people don't like to write about the environment because it gets complicated. It gets dry information. It's statistics. It's chemicals. It's a lot of things that kind of glaze people's eyes over. At this time, when people are in such a rush, right? People jump on their phones, get quick headlines, follow Twitter, and they don't want to sit still and get something that's complicated. Now, the stories are being covered. You look at good work in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, sometimes in the Wall Street Journal. The main papers are still doing it. They're not doing it as much, though. And part of it is also, one of the problems is consolidation. More companies own more outlets than used to. Smaller, in the old days, I have a statistic in the book, 1981, 50 companies owned 90% of the media outlets. A couple of years ago, a statistic found that only 6 companies own 90% of the news outlets. And I have that one right here as well. This is from a Business Insider 2012 report. 6 corporations, GE, Disney, News Corporation, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS, own 90% of the business. That was in 2012. They have changed slightly with buyouts, making the top 6 companies of 2016 to be Comcast, Disney, News Corp, Time Warner, Sony, and National Amusements. That's a far cry from 1983, when 90% of US media was owned by 50 companies. And in many cases, local newspapers were family-owned, right? Most of the newspapers I used to work for were owned by families that would only want 8, 10% profit margin. Now they're bought up by corporations, leveraged in many cases, to own lots of money. They want 20, 25%, 30% profit margin, right? It's terrible. And it doesn't even get into what's covered and the internet. Now I have several chapters on the internet, which, as I said, came in, took a lot of advertising away, and started to affect the profit margins of traditional news outlets. They lost the classifieds, they lost a lot of readership, and people didn't want to pay for news because they were getting it free on the web. But what were they getting free on the web? Poorly resourced stories, rumor in some cases, very biased, left-wing and right-wing, not real traditional fact-finding, well-trained journalism. And that's when you start to get these websites that have fear-based reporting. Worry about this health scare that isn't real. Don't worry about another one. What's big in the news now? What's the big disease that's coming back? Who knows? Measles. Why are measles coming back? People don't want to take that. You guys are good. You're better than my college class. I teach 2 college courses now, too, on media-related issues. Yeah, people don't want vaccines. And you know why? It goes back to a story told years ago that vaccination is bad for you. Completely false. And I'll read this section of the book, and I want to get your questions, because what you have to say is more important than what I have to say. This is from the chapter titled False and Deadly. A recent phenomenon among the false equivalency crowd, because I talk about false equivalency in many ways. Who knows what false equivalency is? Yes. Do you know?
Yeah,
What is it?
Giving equality to both sides.
Right.
Both sides don't have it.
When you give both sides of a story equal space in a news outlet. It started years ago, dating back to the civil rights movement. And there's some of that in the book. And I teach that in a course I teach at York College in Queens called Social Justice Journalism, about how in the civil rights era, many newspapers, especially in the South, would give racists equal footing. They'd allow racists to come up with the claims that African Americans were not equal to whites, for whatever the stupid reason was. Of course, it wasn't true, but they would give them space. That grew into the gay rights issue. A lot of lies about gay people came out. They were pedophiles, they were more likely to do this, they were more likely, all false, of course, but they would get equal space. Today we're seeing it a lot in immigrant coverage. But in the vaccination, what I write in the book says, many people have followed the fake claim for years that the annual flu vaccine caused the flu. Remember that one?
Yes.
Totally untrue. Mainstream media rarely went with this assertion during most regular related reporting. It was some of the outlandish fringe web outlets and some conspiracy television that pushed most of it. But it continues with outlets like the ultra-fake news site YourNewsWire.com, reporting as recently as January 2018 that a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention doctor had said the flu shot was spreading the virus. Snopes.com, a well-respected fact-checking site, labeled YourNews.com a disreputable conspiracy disseminator, quickly labeled the claim false, noting that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention actually urges people to get the flu vaccine. While the flu vaccine falsehood has likely caused many Americans to forego the shot and then get sick, the worst lie revolves around other immunizations like measles, those required for school-aged children, including mumps, chickenpox, and more dangerous afflictions such as polio and whooping cough. With the rise in autism over the past 15 years, from 1 in 150 children born autistic in the US in 1992 to 1 in 59 in 2006, a slow causal claim was vaccines. Among those sites is healthyhomeeconomist.com and quack editor Sarah Pope, whose own website reveals she has no medical or scientific or journalistic training. She holds degrees in economics and government administration. Wow, a person in government administration not telling the truth? She also has ties to the Weston A. Price Foundation, another misleading organization that, among other things, promotes drinking raw milk and has been criticized by the Food and Drug Administration for spreading dangerous advice that autism is caused by vaccinations. She pushed the false narrative on vaccines as recently as May 24th, 2018, in a piece titled 6 Reasons to Say No to Vaccination. Reason number 1, pharmaceutical companies can't be trusted ever. Are you really going to take these companies' word that these shots are safe when their money and profits are impacted by the answer? The remaining 5 are just as ridiculous, including number 6, which is basically that once you're vaccinated, you can't remove the vaccine. Well, maybe you're not supposed to remove the vaccine. But that has not stopped some news outlets from giving her a voice. A 2014 USA Today story about the rise in childhood diseases and the spread of anti-vaccination views quoted her as claiming her 3 children contracted whooping cough and survived, but failed to note her outlandish ties and lack of training. So here's the USA Today, the national newspaper, quoting this woman from this lying website, spreading this false claim. And what do you have now? Measles are spreading like wildfire. So that's another problem I have with news today. Has nothing to do with Donald Trump, has nothing to do with politics, has to do with the web being this even playing field. One of the problems with the web, as I see it, as a necessary evil, because I think it's a great tool for getting newspapers from all over the world. Years ago, when I was young, when you were younger, you wanted to get a newspaper from another town, you had to go to another town. Or you had to go to who remembers the Happeling newsstand in Times Square? You could go there and get newspapers from all over the world. but you had to go out of the way to get them, or get them mailed to you. Now you can go online, you can read any newspaper anywhere, along with a lot of great news sites. The book talks a lot about nonprofit news. Groups like ProPublica, and Center for Investigative Reporting, and New England Center for Investigative Reporting, and the Marshall Project, great mainstream nonprofit news outlets that you can go to on the web as quickly as anywhere else. But one of the problems with the web is everyone who's on there is on equal footing, right? The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, they're on the same internet as this happyeconomics.com or WebNet Daily or the Daily Caller or any of these other lies. So people look at something on the web, they think it's as accurate and credible as anything else on the web. And there's very little control. And one of the other problems is the legal protection for news outlets is dwindling because they have less money. The profits and revenues that are going into the newsroom are cut dramatically. And so when people get sued or try to get access to information, they don't have as much money for legal defense or prosecution of getting information as they might have 20 years ago. So there's a lot less ability to get the news out. And then, of course, we have President Trump, who I don't want to go on a big anti-Trump rant, because I don't talk about his politics. I talk about his opposition to the press. When he calls us the enemy of the people, when he says everything is fake news, he knows it's not. He knows it's true. He just doesn't want them reporting it. So he had a great approach during the 2016 election where he was very much benefited by the news in the beginning, as you all probably remember. A lot of news outlets would cover him with no editing. They'd put the camera on, run his rallies, let him say whatever he wanted, and he slowly would turn against the press. He would tell people, don't believe the people behind me or behind the cameras, right? He'd say, don't trust them, fake news, fake. Now, what was fake? He had no examples. He had no, other than just telling them. Then slowly, people started to distrust the press. You look at studies, and there's some in the book, looking at how are people viewing the press these days. Very low opinion. We're somewhere below corrupt lawyers and murderers and rapists. It's very dangerous because most of the press, I think, is doing a good job. There's some stragglers who don't. There's some, and I go after plenty of them in the book. People, like I said, who just make everything breaking news. People who just focus on one story. Even Trump, who I have no problem grilling the president and reporting on him. But you turn on MSNBC, hour after hour after hour of Trump, right? The Mueller report, when the Mueller report came out, we had one letter from the Attorney General. People were all over it. They were going to say, oh, this is going to get him. This is going to get Trump. MSNBC had people talking impeachment. The end was near. Turns out, at least at this point, there's nothing out of the report that would turn that. Now, we may hear more on the report, but the way it was covered was just on and on and on and on, right? Or if something happens, if there's a hurricane, that's all you see, day after day after day. Or in New York area. I live in New Jersey. We get some of the same TV as you do, right? There's a storm, a winter storm in New York. Forget morning programming. We have, 50 people out in the snow. And they're all saying the same thing. It's snowing. Isn't there other news going on? No. Oh, okay, I guess not. That's what they like. Or school shootings. School shootings are another over-covered thing in many ways. Now, if a school shooting occurs and people die, it's horrible. And we're not too far from Sandy Hook, which is a terrible, devastating... A story behind that would have been more interesting about how this person got a gun. And do gun laws really stop those kind of... There's a lot of debate. But if there's a school shooting, they want everyone to be afraid of going to school. Well, in reality, you're much safer going to school, much more likely to get struck by lightning than to have you or your child die in a school shooting. But that's where the fear-mongering goes. Then a lot of incorrect information gets out, right? There's fear factor. That's another thing in the book. What else? Remember the Ebola scare? We were all going to die of Ebola. The poor woman in New Jersey who had to stay in a tent for several days because Governor Christie and Governor Cuomo conspired for these tight restrictions. It was all based on nothing. They wouldn't let people go to a bowling alley where the guy had bowled, even though there was no basis at all that it was unhealthy or unsafe. Years ago, remember the swine flu vaccine? Killed 27 people. I remember. Did anyone even know what swine flu was? No. but someone decided it was the scare of the week. That's a very scary thing with health coverage. And I have information in the book talking to health journalists who say the cutbacks in health coverage are worse and worse and worse. There are very few people actually dedicated to covering health and health issues at a time when Obamacare and whatever health program the federal government does is getting more and more attention. They're not covered as well. They're not covered in the environment as well. It's Trump, it's scary hurricanes, it's vaccinations are going to kill you. It's a lot of misinformation and undercovered elements. But as I say in the book, one of the things that I think is very important that's helping is nonprofit news. The news outlets I mentioned, I think there's almost 200 of them in the Institute for Nonprofit News. That's the National Association. The ones I mentioned, ProPublica. There's another one in New Orleans called The Lens. I do some examples from their work on post-Katrina environmental issues. There's the Marshall Project. There are 3 in New Jersey that are really good. NJ Spotlight is one near where I work. Connecticut has several. That's a basis to do it right. If it was up to me, every news outlet would be nonprofit, just because you could focus on the coverage. Now, is that going to happen? No. There's too much money being made on media outlets for other things. People like to watch Fox. They like to watch MSNBC. People having talking heads all night. Who remembers when CNN first started? I was a CNN intern 30 years ago when it was newscasts all day, and then Larry King at night. Not anymore. They have newscasts, but there's always a twinge of opinion, a twinge of talking head, and at night, it's one talking head show after another. Now, some of them do reporting. I think Brett Baer on Fox and Shep Smith on Fox do a pretty good job, even though I'm not a big Fox fan. MSNBC, Rachel Maddow does some good research, but she clearly gives her opinion. And a lot of times at night, that's the stories you get, is the opinion, the talking heads, the debate, not necessarily the reporting. So I think there's a lot of problems with news. I don't think they're unsolvable at all. I think most news is still well done, but I think the issues are what I've been talking about. Things like the cutbacks, the attempts to sway voters one way or the other. And when it comes to Trump, I think there are some White House reporters that go overboard a little bit. I think there are a lot of reporters who think he's such a terrible president, and there's plenty of proof that he is, that they go a little bit over, not in terms of bias, but in terms of getting their own opinions in too much when they shouldn't. If a lot of you probably saw the Jim Acosta confrontation with Trump a while back. He probably went over the line a little bit, getting into a fight with him a little bit, pushing his buttons. It's very difficult. I have information in the book about the New York Times. If any of you saw the special that Showtime did last year called The Fourth Estate, it's a 4-part series, it's still on Showtime. It followed the New York Times coverage of Trump during his first year, a very good presentation of what it was like in the newsroom. And there's a point where Dean Baquet, their executive editor, who was a great Pulitzer Prize winning reporter and editor, he tells the staff, we can't look like we're going after this guy. And you can't. You have to try to be fair-minded. Otherwise, you're not a reporter. And it's very unique because we've never had a president like this. Whatever you think of Trump, he lies constantly. He accuses the press of falsehoods that aren't true. He angrily attacks the press and many different groups. And he has a lot of people who don't like him, but he also has a lot of people who do like him. So you have the press in a position they've never really been in before, covering a president like no other, at a time when we have Twitter, we have the internet, we have 24-hour news demanding constant update. There really is no deadline anymore, right? When I started my first job, I had till 6, 7 o'clock at night to write a couple stories, fact check them, edit them, have them edited. They get out in the next day's paper. Not today. Something happens now, it's online instantly. And there are several examples in the book of news outlets that got it wrong, right? You talk about the Boston Marathon bombing, which was up north from here, terrible tragedy. There's several examples in the book of how many elements of that story were wrongly reported. They had certain suspects, they had people who were claimed to be suspects, not true. The Las Vegas shooting, remember that one not too long ago? A lot of false reporting came out of that online. People following Twitter accounts of alleged witnesses. You don't know who they are or what they saw. A lot of times Twitter and Facebook can be a good resource for covering news, and I get into that in the book. But it's a tricky thing. You have to check your facts, check your sources, right? How many people here get news on Twitter? Don't be shy. No? Good. How many, most people get their news from a daily newspaper? Yeah? Oh, good. I like that. How many people get news from local news, New York or the New Haven market? CBS, ABC? Yeah? That's good. PBS, yes. NPR, I'm a big NPR fan. But even they're getting cut back, right?
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
You talk about local news. Isn't it being consumed by Clear Channel? Or
Yes. Clear Channel and CBS and ABC affiliates are getting part of the consolidation I was talking about, the companies that are taking over. Sinclair's the other one. Those are the two that are big.
It's a more conservative slant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a mention in the book the instance where Sinclair sent out a mandatory statement to be read by all their anchors, basically attacking mainstream news. That got a lot of pushback. So it's very, you really have to be the diligent consumer of news. You have to find your news outlets, whether it's a website, newspaper, magazine, blog, that has a track record and can be trusted. And that takes some work, and not rely on just things you see. And the other problem is when you're on Twitter or Facebook, people put things up and you instantly might believe it. But that's why I mentioned the site Snopes.com. I would urge you to go to them. A very good accuracy and fact-checking site. There's also factcheck.org, politifact.org, fact-checking sites that do things in checking whether something you see on the web is true. I often will get things on Facebook, someone posts, and I'll immediately go to Snopes, check it. It'll either say it's true or it's not, and then I go back to the Facebook and say, no, what you posted isn't right. But people don't know. Anyway, thank you for listening. I want to take any questions or comments. Yes?
Joe, how you doing?
Hello.
I really appreciate you bringing this to light because it's absolute truth that you're speaking. The problem that you're talking about in the news industry of consolidation is happening everywhere. It's supermarkets, it's wholesale level,
Yes.
stuff like that. And of course, with less opportunity for variety, that's the less opportunity the consumer gets.
Yes.
So it's a problem not only in your industry, I'm in the wholesale wine industry. We used to have 28 distributors in Connecticut, there are 3 now.
Wow.
So you don't see those products on your shelves anymore.
Yes.
And you can't even get the product to market because the wholesaler only has so many square feet. So what happens is you have a herd mentality in terms of news, and a falsehood gets posted and people believe it because people just don't want to do the work by themselves.
Yes.
So you're bringing to light a true problem, but where do you see it going? Where do you see the truth coming out?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that we have to do is not support the news outlets that are inaccurate and not credible, and support those that are. But you're right, a lot of it is out of our hands. When major corporations are taking over the sites, and not all of them are bad, a lot of them put money into it. Jeff Bezos, who's had other problems, he bought the Washington Post, and he's put a lot of money into it and helped it a lot. The New York Times also has had a lot of outside money put in. But the problem comes in the local markets. The Hour is still here and doing work, but it doesn't have as many people as it used to. The Stanford Advocate, the Hartford Courant, the Dayton Daily News, the San Antonio Express News. None of them have the people they had years ago, and they're having to do more because they're not just publishing a print paper every day. They're publishing every minute. There's news. So they have fewer people doing more work, probably in your business as well, and in all the business, that's true. We were driving around here lately and noticing, I've even noticed, I think Norwalk, which I don't get to come to a lot, has a lot of independent shops still, but a lot that aren't. There's a Subway right out the window, right? Where's, Joe's Sub Shop, or, Fred's Grocery, or whatever it might have been 20, 30 years ago. It's not. There's Subway, there's The Gap, there's Amazon.com, where I'm selling my book. There's not as many independent bookstores anymore, right?
Pizza.
That's everywhere.
There's a lot
Pizza,
is
Papa John's.
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of
Domino.
family-owned
Yes.
pizza places in Connecticut, at least in
Yes.
Norwalk.
No, and in the whole New York area, I think people still want real pizza. But in many cases, you're right. It's something that affects everything. I'm a little bit I'm a little bit of a news snob. I think news is more important than some other things. Wine distribution is important, pizza is important, Subway is important, believe me. I eat a lot more and drink a lot more than I read news in some cases, as many of you do. But I always say news is the only industry and the only profession with constitutional protection, right? It's right there in the First Amendment, which I used to have tacked over my desk when I was in college, which I also tell people, this is unrelated to news, but the First Amendment says more about freedom of religion than it says about anything else, so, yes.
What do you think of the arrest of Julian Assange?
Oh, I was waiting for that. I have mixed feelings about Assange. How many of you people are supporters of his? Do you know who Julian Assange is? Who supports him? WikiLeaks, yeah.
I did.
Who doesn't support him? Yeah, I do a media ethics class at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, and we always talk about the Pentagon Papers, which were a leaked government document, and Watergate, there was leaked government information involved in that, and the recent wiretapping stories that the New York Times and the Washington Post won Pulitzers for, leaked information about how the government was conducting secret wiretaps of regular citizens. Assange was, in those cases, someone else had gotten the information and leaked it to the press. In Assange's case, much of the information he got himself and leaked, much of it had to do with personal information that wasn't really newsworthy. So I kind of go back and forth. It's kind of surprising that he wasn't arrested until recently, because they knew where he was, and he was facing criticism. I don't know. It's a mixed bag, yes.
Isn't that a danger, though, to the First Amendment? The tremendous criticism of Assange right now and the illegal acts that are done by England, Britain, UK, right now to shut him up and...
If you consider them illegal acts.
Yeah, and
what Britain is doing, or what he himself did?
What Britain is doing,
Yeah.
by going in there and pulling him out. And that, you know, it's asylum is a very sacred thing.
Yes.
I think you know. And that's what he had, and Britain blew the whistle on that. And
Yeah.
I think it's awful. I think that Ellsberg was a tremendous precedent,
Yes.
showing the Pentagon Papers, and I think it's really, really bad what they're doing to Assange.
I think it's a tricky situation. Again, I think it's a little different when he's the one taking the information versus having it leaked to him. That might be a fine point that other people wouldn't agree with. But you mentioned the Pentagon Papers, and Daniel Ellsberg was the contracting employee who leaked those to the Post and the New York Times. Have any of you seen that movie that came out last year, The Post?
Yes.
Very good movie. And I've been lucky enough to interview Ellsberg. And I think it's tricky. I don't like that Assange sort of abused that right. I think when you abuse the right, you get a little bit,
Didn't the New York
you
Times-
lose my sympathy.
Didn't the New York Times and Washington Post abuse it too by publishing
It's
it?
different. Publishing it is different than hacking and getting it.
But some people might
Hacking
not,
is a crime. Publishing
some people
is
might
not a
not
crime.
agree with that. I think you're right, but a lot of people agree with you. You're right. There's one of the great things about media ethics is there's not necessarily right or wrong answer in some cases. It depends on how you look at it. There's a case I talk about in my media ethics class. I think I mentioned this in the book a little. Years ago, if you remember the Chiquita Banana Cincinnati Enquirer case, anybody remember that?
No.
Chiquita is based in Cincinnati. The Enquirer did a big series exposing all kinds of fraud and mismanagement and illegal activities Chiquita was conducting in other countries, including running drugs.
Isn't that United Fruit?
Yes,
In the
It was-
past?
Chiquita. It was Chiquita. I don't know if United Fruit is Chiquita. I don't know that.
Yeah, I think it is.
You're probably right. But anyway, in doing this reporting, their reporter, Michael Gallagher, stole voicemails from the company. He somehow hacked into their voicemail system. This was 1997. I bet the voicemail system was much less secure than it is now. He hacked into their system, stole voicemails that had messages from company executives admitting that they were doing this. And they ran a big multi-part series, and when it came out that they had stolen emails, Chiquita sued Gannett, which owned the Cincinnati Enquirer, and still does, and Gannett basically agreed to a settlement for $10 million. They fired Gallagher and the then editor, and they ran a big front page apology, which a lot of people in the newsroom did not like, because they felt that the story was true, and it was true. But they did this one illegal activity, which ethically is wrong and legally is wrong. So a lot of people said, you ran the right story, but you did something illegal and improper to get it. You could say the same about Assange.
In case of Assange, I question Ecuador's action that removing asylum from him. For what reason, we don't know.
I don't know. That's a very tricky case.
Yeah, I don't
know all the fine points on it.
I don't blame England going after him. They went after him after Ecuador, the country, withdrew this asylum situation from him.
Yeah, the report was Ecuador asked them to come in because he was living in
Yeah.
squalor.
That's the other thing, is he was, and if you see when he was arrested, he looked in pretty bad shape.
He looked like David Letter.
Hey, Joe. Hey, Joe.
It's interesting. Yes,
In
sir.
a case, if someone else stole it and gave it to the paper to publish, everything is fine.
I don't know if everything's fine.
No?
I don't know. It's a tricky question.
But if it is fine, then Assange is correct, because he was given this stuff, he didn't steal it.
But he had hacked in, his people had hacked into
No,
part of it.
Russia, they say
That's the
Russia-
other thing, the Russian connection is very scary, yes.
Yeah.
It's all, listen, you're better off not doing things as blatantly, because I don't think Assange's ultimate goal was necessarily always proper, where he just wanted to expose and embarrass. And he also exposed emails from the Democratic Party. What was the news value in that?
There was a lot of news value in your
Well,
Bernie
It
supporter.
worked on Hillary.
Well, is that news value, or is that trying to sabotage a campaign? I don't know.
Like, it shows that they are not truthful to the public. You know, they do something differently privately and tell you something differently.
The other question comes up, things like that though, when you're breaking the law to get information. I think it's a case-by-case basis. You can have an argument on either side.
I'm not sure that he broke the law.
That's true too. Yes.
What is your media diet? Can you give us a sense?
Oh, God.
Junkie.
How dare you turn my question back on? Well, I get the New York Times at home every day.
Print?
Yes. I was getting the Star Ledger, but I'm going to start getting it again. I get it online. I go online and check Twitter. I do, but usually news sites, not just what other people put up. I listen to the radio all the time, top of the hour, CBS News. I like CBS Local 88 because they open every hour with a national update, and then they go into local. I often watch CBS Morning News because I think they're mostly news compared to today and Good Morning America. My wife and I like their 90 seconds, we give you the world, your world in 90 seconds. And then they give you a bunch of headlines, and then they go into real news. I also search, I have a lot of news feeds for The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, CNN.com. I peek at Fox now and then, just to see as much as I can take, because there's so many things I don't do right. And I also watch a lot of local news at night just to get their headlines. Yes.
I want to get back to Chiquita.
Yes.
I went on my phone.
Yeah.
It's owned by a company in North Carolina called Sorrel or something, but they've been acquired, they're private now.
Yeah. Did they say who owned them in '97?
Well, I can't do all of that.
You can't do all that research immediately?
I think years ago it was United Fruit.
That sounds right, too,
And
yeah.
Republics and things like that,
Yeah.
But right now it isn't.
Right. They made a lot of money on it.
One
Yes.
thing you didn't mention, so
Please.
one word, Russia.
Russia, yeah. What about Russia? There's a lot to say.
Yes, about fake news.
Yes.
I mean, it was so influential, in other countries, influencing on news.
Yes, and they used Facebook, despite what our president thinks. I just finished reading a great book called Zucked by one of the co-founders of, or not co-founders, but one of the early co-executives of Facebook, who writes tremendously about how Russia used Facebook to penetrate our campaign and election by putting in false news. A lot of false news, and a lot of whatever you think of the Mueller report or the investigation of Trump, they came out with clear evidence that Russia was infiltrating the campaign. Whether Trump was involved is another matter, but they did influence, and a lot of it was using it online.
Who's to blame, Russia or Facebook?
That's a good question.
Russia is a job, you know. They
Facebook
do it. Every country
got away with a lot,
The
and they are
Russians,
still unprosecuted, right? They're still making billions of dollars, and Facebook is still, Facebook, you talk about years ago when a lot of these banks were going under and they said they're too big to fail. I think Facebook is too big to lose for some people. Billions of people go on, myself included, go on every day. And not only is your data collected, but your view is swayed so much by the algorithms they use. So I would say, yeah, I'd probably blame both, yes.
So what does it say about us? That we accept the fake news, we don't look for the real news, we go to, accept commentators' opinion rather than real report. A lot of these people that we listen to, and they are loud and, act like they know everything, they don't really, they're not reporters, they're
Yes.
just expressing their opinion.
That's a good question. I think a lot of it is
biased opinion.
I think a lot of it is the equal footing that the internet gives, as I mentioned earlier. Anything on the internet is given the same weight as anything else. As people see things that are on the internet, they believe them more. They read things, they believe them more.
So that's what I mean.
Yeah.
What is it about us that we want to believe?
I don't know, I'm not a psychology major. That's a good question.
It's discussed broadly. It's called confirmation bias,
Yeah.
and it just needs to be.
Well, a lot of it now is with the handheld devices. Here's mine, and I have my iPad. A lot of people are on these things all day, right? And you're in your silo, you're in your zone, you're in your private area. And because you can go on a website or get a feed, you can follow on Twitter whoever you want. So you can follow people you agree with. Or you can go on Fox if you agree with them. Or you can go on MSNBC if you agree with them. Or you can go on rightwingliar.com or leftwingbias.org or whatever the site is and see only news you want. But in the old days when you have a newspaper or even a regular newscast that was basic and mainstream, you flip through the paper, right? That's one of the things I love about reading the paper. And you all who read it know as well. You flip through, you see different stories you wouldn't see. Almost every day in the New York Times or any other paper I read, I will come across a story I probably wouldn't have looked for. But I see it, I read it, you get to see different things. You go online, what do you see? You see a front page, or more often than not, you will get on Twitter a tweet or a link, and you will go directly to that story. You won't go to the full page. You won't go to the full, even story in some cases. So you can see news that you agree with and news that you want and ignore the rest. They used to call it eating your vegetables, right? Nowadays, in the old days, you'd go through the paper and eat your vegetables to get to the dessert, whether it's an interesting story or the sports section or whatever. Not anymore. Like, remember the old days when you got a new record from the store? Remember records? You could put on the record. I listened to the whole, I put on and get a record. Scotty's Record Shop. And play the whole record. And play the other side. Or even a cassette. Either to fast forward or listen to, not now. Go on iTunes, listen to whatever you want. Same thing with news. You can go read whatever you want, whether you agree with it or not. And that's and you don't have to listen to people that you don't agree with. Unfriend somebody or unconnect from Twitter. Yes?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes by Mark Twain, which I think
I love
reflects what we're doing today. His quote was, "People who don't read the newspapers are uninformed. People who do read the newspapers are misinformed."
A former reporter, Twain was as well. Yeah, he became not a great friend of the press. That reminds me of a funny Twain story. Any of you ever live in the Bay Area, San Francisco? Or visit? They had a columnist named Herb Cain.
Yeah.
You remember Herb Cain? He used to work at the Sacramento Union, which is no longer with us. And he said, whenever they needed money for beer, they would find an old desk and they would sell it as Mark Twain's desk. Because he had worked there. He said they must have sold at least 10 desks over 10 years. But Twain was no fan of the press, right? Isn't he the one who said, a lie can get halfway around the world by the time the truth puts on its shoes? Yes, sir.
Behind a lot of this is the erosion in belief of fact, whether it's science or otherwise. Where did that come about, and why are people so willing to believe somebody just saying something rather than somebody studied an issue or done research for 10 years.
That's a good point. And one of the big issues, I get into this in the book too, is climate change. There's so much factual evidence about climate change, and we seem to be the only country that doesn't want to believe it. Part of it is there's a lot of right-wing and conservative myth that spreads the fake news. In the book I talk about, there was one report that came out of Europe by one scientist who was later discredited that talked about climate change not being man-made and not being as bad as it is. And that spread like crazy and then was later debunked heavily. And I did a story when I was an editor of Media Matters talking to business reporters who said, there's no evidence from a business standpoint that climate change isn't real. And from a business standpoint, believing climate change is real and following the scientists is better business. Then I did a story talking to a lot of European reporters who said this is nonsense, that it's not real. That most European news coverage, and I don't go to Europe, maybe some of you do and see it more than I do, but from what they were saying, most European and even Far East coverage doesn't even debate climate change.
Yes.
But for some reason in this country, we do. And you're right, it's all baseless. And then you get these Congress people who, when there's a big storm, whether whether it shows a high increase in temperature or decrease, they'll try to use that to claim it's not real. When in reality, that's part of the problem. Yes?
Channel 13, 2 nights ago, had a retrospective about fluorocarbons, ozone layers.
Yeah, that's another good issue.
Yeah, and it took the whole world to come to an agreement that we have to...
Yes.
Right. So why isn't that happening with, like you said, Europe is legal. It's a worldwide effort. I mean, we only have one Earth.
Yes.
So the Koch brothers seem to be in control.
Yes, there's a lot of thought that you have a government distrust, which I don't trust the government all the time either. I think I have a healthy skepticism, not quite cynicism, but getting there. And a lot of people just don't trust the government. A lot of that's egged on by a lot of politicians and a lot of the right-wing news that we're talking about, and some left-wing. They're not completely out of it. I do a whole section in the false equivalency part of the book on abortion. There's a lot of false equivalency about abortion on both sides. The pro-lifers will spread lies about abortion, but a lot of the pro-choicers will too. And you have to steer it down to the right thing. But you're right. And a lot of it is that we're in social media, the internet. I call the internet a necessary evil, like I said earlier, because there's a lot you can get from it. I did a lot of my research on the internet. And I sell a lot of books on the internet. But it's also kind of a Wild West show. And the government kind of came into it without any warning. The internet kind of came out of nowhere. At first, news outlets didn't even really consider it to be a valid part of news. And then they realized they started giving away news for free because other sites were free. And that's when they started losing money. Now most of them require some payment. You can't go on a lot of these websites and newspaper sites without eventually paying something. So, any other questions? Yes?
You might agree with the old assertion that citizen journalism is akin to citizen dentistry.
To a degree, yes.
And I think we all lament the loss of the trusted filter of big city newspapers, because you have editors who vet a story to be sure it has accuracy. It might necessarily have to be balanced. And recently the New York Times editor, maybe you remember this piece, told somebody that he thought within 10 years you might not see a print edition of the New York Times.
I think that's true.
Because there's no money
Yes.
to support this. Now, what do you tell your journalism students about where they're going to find work?
I don't have a problem with the web as news source. I think when they say newspapers are dying, I say, no, I don't think they're dying. I think they're just moving. What it costs to print a newspaper and deliver it is ridiculous. Newsprint prices, there was a recent huge increase. A lot of newsprint comes from Canada. Huge increase in newsprint. A lot of these papers can't handle it. A lot of newspapers still print, but they only print a couple days a week.
Well, was it a mistake in the early days of the internet for newspapers to start giving away
Yes.
their product?
Very much a
They gave
mistake.
it away, and they gave away their entire
Yes,
business.
that's lots of that in the book too. They gave it away because a lot of the internet is free. They felt like, we'll give it away and we'll just exist on advertising. Because in print, most of the money newspapers were making were from advertising. You pay your subscription or your 25 cents back in the day. Now it's up to $3, I think, for the Times, a newsstand. Even that doesn't cover it. It was advertising. But advertising on the web is very different than advertising in print. Because like I said before, you read a newspaper, you're turning the pages, you're seeing all the ads. If you're Macy's and you run an ad in the New York Times, you could say, look, you could say to Macy's, look, we know we have 400,000 readers. But if you're a website and you say to Macy's, we have 1 million readers a day, 1 million readers a month, whatever it might be, Macy's can look at the data and say, yeah, but only 50,000 are looking at our ad. And only 10,000 are clicking our ad that goes to our site. So what was bragged about as 400,000 readers 10 years ago might just be 10,000 actual valued potential consumers. And Macy's knows that, and they're not going to pay you as much. And while ad revenue on the web is going up, the specific amounts are not. And that's one of the reasons.
No other business I can think of has self-destructed.
Self-destructed, yes.
Just giving it away.
Yes. Somebody want to answer this? Yes.
Just a couple quick questions. What is your take on Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour?
I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
What specifically? Anything?
That's just news. I mean, really.
Yeah. Well, PBS NewsHour could be one of the most boring shows in many ways, but it's one of the most informational.
Informative.
I'm a big PBS fan, big Bill Moyers Presents fan, a big Frontline fan.
We haven't seen anything from Bill Moyers recently.
No, he's retired.
He was retired before, but he came back.
Yeah, but then
Now he's really retired.
his Bill Moyers Presents no longer is being produced.
What did you think of IBM buying the Weather Channel?
That's in the book. I talk about the Weather Channel naming storms. Remember that? Did you see that? They started naming storms. And it was all publicity.
But hasn't the weather gotten crappier since they bought it?
I don't know if you can blame them. No, the National Weather Service names hurricanes, right? And years ago, they used to name them only after women. That didn't last. A lot of people didn't like that. So now they name, I think it's men and women alphabetically. But the Weather Channel, which is also owned, I believe, by Comcast, or was. When you say IBM bought,
What's
yeah.
that?
Comcast, NBC. They started naming storms. And I have an item in the book about the National Weather Service sent them a very harsh letter saying, please don't name any more storms. Because that makes us look like we're doing it and we're not. And it's misleading. Yes?
Joe, I think you've done an excellent job of identifying the problems that are manifold and abundant in the news media and the news media industry. You also stated earlier these problems are solvable, but I have not yet heard you describe any of those solutions. Do we have to buy the book?
You do have to buy the book. There are a lot of solutions that are yet to be found. It's not all happiness. The problems are not all solved, and that's why people have to look at ways to solve them. I think one of them is the nonprofit outlets that I talk about and keep supporting them and try to get more of those done. But also, I think as consumers, we have to support the valid, credible news sites, not only with readership, but with subscription and even donation to some of these nonprofits. If you go look at the Institute for Nonprofit News online, I think it's inn.org.
Yes.
But if you search it, you'll find it thinking. You can donate to all these places. Look at ProPublica, Inside Climate News have won Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting. Donate, read them, support them, subscribe to The Hour, subscribe to the New York Times, subscribe to The Advocate, subscribe to anything that provides good news. Watch CNN or MSNBC or news outlet X, whatever it might be that's good, and don't support the ones that lie. Don't support the bad, misinforming sites or news outlets or channels.
May I add something to that?
Yes.
So you mentioned nonprofit news several times. Here in Norwalk, we are very lucky to have Nancy on Norwalk.
Nancy on Norwalk, which is here videoing us.
Yes, a nonprofit news site covering schools, the Board of Education, covering the Common Council, covering city government, and covering development. And we are members of the Institute for Nonprofit News.
There you go.
We are supported by reader donations. As Joe mentioned, a reporter from Nancy on Norwalk is here today, Harold Coben, and this will be on the website should you or any of your friends want to watch it again. One last note, while other outlets are cutting back, are shedding jobs, Nancy on Norwalk is actually looking to hire a freelancer. So if you are here and you are a journalist, or you know someone who is, or you are interested in writing about local news, please see me afterwards.
And one thing I noticed having talking to you, both of you, is you have the experience. You have news experience, you have news training, there's valid news ability in that website. There isn't always that in a lot of places. You mentioned the citizen journalism. I am very skeptical of. But I think it helps if you have someone covering something rather than no one, but you also diminish the coverage sometimes if you have people who don't know how to cover. They'll cover, I've seen where I live and other places, a lot of these websites come up and they will send even parents out to a school board meeting. And they'll write about the school. They don't know anything necessarily about how to cover a meeting. Just like I may not know how to fix a faucet or fix your air conditioning or whatever it is. My wife knows. I call repairmen for everything. I can mow the lawn still, but that's about it. But you need to cross that tight line, walk that tight line between having people cover things that wouldn't be covered, but also knowing how to ask questions, what to ask, demand information. That's another thing. I'll say this quickly, and then I'll stop because I appreciate all your time. The legal aspect is very scary because newspapers and news outlets are having a tougher time getting information. The Trump administration doesn't want to give out information, but as much as they are anti-press, the Obama administration was very secretive too. Yeah. They went after more reporters than any previous administration. They subpoenaed more reporters than any previous administration, including Nixon. They were very secretive about it. Obama wasn't on TV calling us the enemy of the people or calling it fake news, but a lot of people in his Justice Department were trying to clamp down coverage. I have a lot in the book about Freedom of Information Act. Who knows what Freedom of Information Act is? Everybody know that? Right, it's your right as a citizen to file for public information. And I do it all the time. In the town I cover in New Jersey, I used to have a website called maplewoodian.com, which I ran for 8 years. And I was lucky enough to win 2 awards for coverage at the school board. And I had filed many Freedom of Information Act requests for school board budgets, for invoices, for emails. And in 2 cases, the school board declined to give me the information. In one case, last year, they conducted a search for a new superintendent. And they put out a request for proposal, which means different firms submit their proposal to get the job to help them find a new superintendent. 3 firms submitted proposals. I filed a Freedom of Information request for those proposals. They denied it. They wouldn't give it to me. They said they'd give it to me after they chose somebody. Well, it's not news then. I have a First Amendment lawyer who's very good, who filed a lawsuit. We won. They had to pay him his fees. I didn't get any money, but I got the information. 2 years earlier, we had a bullying issue in our town. A coach was being accused of bullying. He ended up being fired. And they had to hire outside attorneys to handle the case. And I filed for invoices of those attorneys to see what's being spent and how. The school district denied that one. My lawyer sued, we won, we got the invoices, they had to pay him his fees. That's just basic. And a lot of journalists not only don't know about how to do that or have the time to do that, and in many cases not the motivation to do that because they have to do 10 other things. But you also have a lot of people filing libel and slander suits against the press more than they ever did. And when you have this anti-press fervor, in part from the president and in part from other officials, people start to sway their opinion against the press and start saying things like, oh, why do we have to give you this information, right? I was trained, and a lot of reporters are trained, try to get as much information as you can from everywhere. I always say a reporter can ask anybody anything. Doesn't mean they have to answer. Doesn't mean you have to report the answer, right? So people get this view that reporters are less important than the politicians who are attacking them. When you start trusting a politician over a reporter, I think we have problems. So, any other questions? And then who wants to, someone tell me when I have to finish, although I'm glad to answer. Yes.
I just wondered,
I want to give you a chance to buy the book, too.
this anti-journalism climate, do you fear for or afraid that more reporters are actually in physical danger?
Yes, that's a good point. There's a lot in the book about that. Not only in our country, you know, Katie Tur is an NBC reporter who followed Trump around. She wrote a book, and in it she talked about being physically intimidated. Other reporters have been attacked. In other countries, reporters are being attacked and jailed and killed more than ever. There's a great resource, the Committee to Protect Journalists. Go on their site. I believe it's cpj.org, or you can just Google it. They have a running tally of reporters in danger, being killed, being kidnapped, being prosecuted, jailed. That's always on the rise. And you've had the president basically saying, go after the reporters. You know, throw them out, jail them. And when people have been found to have attacked him, he supports it. And he's not the only one. It's all part of the, I think, a lot of the conflict in our country now politically. People feel like a lot of this is because of the web. You can go on the web, spout your opinion, right? You can attack someone on the web, whether it's a comment at a Facebook thing or Twitter. People are attacking each other all the time. The discourse has gotten so raw that people think they can go after reporters, and most reporters just want to get the news out. Most of us don't want to slant opinion. I got into news because I'm nosy. I'm a nosy, curious person, and most reporters are. Do I have my own opinions on news? Sure. But I think myself and others in the biz, we want to get the news out. We get more of a high and more of a satisfaction breaking a big story than we would slanting the story. I mean, anyone can do that, right? You don't get into news because you make big money or get easy hours or get a lot of public acclaim. You get into it because you get bit by the bug. And sadly, I still have been bit, but I love it. So, any others? Yes?
I think the fundamental problem that we have is everything is for sale. As long as you have the money, you can buy. If you want to buy, you can buy senators, you can buy representatives, you can buy news, you can buy everything. As long as you have the money, you can do it.
That's probably true. I still think most news is trying to be correct. But last question, then I want you to get a chance to buy and eat your food.
Since you mentioned that the major corporations are consolidating control and they
Yes.
require 20% returns.
Or more, yes.
Or more. I was wondering what your thoughts would be on actually trying to regulate news sources such that they couldn't make more than a regulated return like they do for public utilities. I mean, I think that the press is so important that it needs to be confined to people who are not driven by, what will sell the most.
I think that's tricky. As I said earlier, I'm a big nonprofit news fan, but I know that will not happen for everything. I worry when the government starts regulating news. I don't trust government enough.
Isn't that a mark of a building dictatorship coming?
You could say that. It definitely makes fearful. The funny thing, one of the things about Trump is he has so little knowledge of half the things he says. When he talked about he wants to improve, he wants to strengthen federal libel laws. Well, there are no federal libel laws. All libel laws are state laws. So, start making things up like that and fearing people. I get worried when the government starts regulating things like that. But if the press doesn't improve itself, you're going to get that. That's the old saying. In the old days when you used to have cigarette ads on TV, they stopped. Not because the government stopped them, but because they were threatening to try to regulate it and stop it, that the news outlets stopped it. That was just one example.
How can they improve themselves?
How can the news outlets improve themselves? Yeah. I think implementing a lot of things I talk about. Getting away from a lot of the demands for coverage and laziness. That's why it's called greed, laziness, and Donald Trump. The greed of the companies trying to squeeze out everything they can, and the laziness, not of reporters, but of the news outlets going for the quick story. Entertainment and the easy story, the hours of talking heads, the hours of talking about one story on and on and on, speculating rather than reporting. A lot of environmental stories that don't get covered. Like I said, health stories, science stories, school needs, local news. That's the real killer. There's a saying that's come about recently called news deserts, areas of the country that have no local news at all. You know, some rural areas, some areas that don't have affiliate of TV, don't have a daily paper, barely have a weekly paper. They don't get anything. Stuff happens, no one knows about it because they're not covering the water board, the regional board, the Board of Education, the garbage company's contract that might have some payoff involved or whatever it might be, right? When I was in California, I worked for a paper, the Press Enterprise. We had a small town I covered, Colton, California, one of the most corrupt towns I've ever been to. They had a garbage scandal. The garbage company was paid off, or the garbage company was paying off city councilmen to approve their contract. And I got a hold of it and broke the story, and 3 people ended up in jail. And you know, that was not even really creative. But if newspapers or news outlets aren't covering it, it doesn't happen. So anyway, I will let you come and buy the book if you want. Thank you for coming and listening to me, and I hope you can read it and enjoy it. Thank you.